Today we are going to be looking at the book of Esther, and it tells the story of the Queen of Persia. The main lesson that we learn there is that pride always comes before a fall, and in this case, a pretty big fall. It's a phenomenal book, the book of Esther, a fascinating read, and I'd encourage you to read it. Don't just listen to this sermon, but read the entire book. It's only 10 chapters, and I'm sure you'd find it not only interesting but challenging and also very, very funny. Some people have struggled with this book over the years because the name of God isn't mentioned in the book once. But here's what I want to say is that the name of God may not be mentioned, but his fingerprints are absolutely everywhere. To get a true appreciation of the plot of the story of Esther, we need to go a little bit further back in time, though, to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And there we read where King Saul was instructed to go to war against the Amalekites. And he was told to devote to destruction everything. That meant killing not only all the people, but all of the animals, everything. Burn the crops and just destroy absolutely everything. Now, pride got to Saul. He didn't kill everything. He didn't devote to destruction everything, but instead what he did was he kept some of the crops, some of the animals, and he kept the king alive. Now, we might think, okay, well, that was being merciful, but in Saul's case, at that time in history, this was an issue of pride, because in those days, the conquering king would take the captive king and maim him in some way or another. Typically, they would chop off the big toes, chop off the thumbs, and this would leave the person to actually crawl around your courts and beg for mercy at every possible opportunity. So Samuel the prophet hears about what Saul has done, and he goes and says, "Did you do what God asked you to do?" To which Saul answers, "Yes, of course I did." And Samuel says, "But is that the bleating of sheep that I hear?" And then he makes this, what is now quite a famous quote. He says, "Saul, to obey is better than sacrifice." And so he brings out King Agag, and the Bible says that Samuel himself killed King Agag, and it was at that moment that Saul's lost his kingship, and David was then brought in as the king. So now we jump into the book of Esther. The story begins with King Xerxes, the king of Persia. His other name was Ahasuerus, but let's not worry too much about that. Xerxes is easier to pronounce. And he is struggling with a political issue. What do I do with the Greeks? Now, King Xerxes, his empire stretched from India all the way across to Ethiopia, a massive stretch of land, and the Greeks were rising in power. And so he didn't know what to do, so he gathered together all of his generals, and they had this 6-month conference, debating, discussing, what do we do with the Greeks? And they came up with what they thought was a solution. They were going to attack at Thermopylae, and of course you can follow the story by watching the movie 300, where Leonidas, the Greek, takes on Xerxes and the Persian army, but let's leave that for another day. King Xerxes, once they've come up with their solution, they begin a feast. And to entertain his guests, he calls for his wife, who at that stage was Queen Vashti, and he asks her to entertain his guests by dancing before them, to which she answers, "No ways. I'm not going to entertain your guests. Who do you think I am?" And of course, the king then gets very upset, and he, long story short, she is dethroned, and he starts a beauty competition which lasts for a couple of years, perhaps. I say that because the contestants, not only were they rounded up from every corner of his land, but they went through 12 months of beauty treatment before they appeared before the king. And that's where our heroine, Esther, comes in, because she is one of the most beautiful women. Long story short, she actually wins this competition. And so she becomes the king. While she is in her beauty preparation process, her uncle, because she happens to be an orphan, She was raised by her uncle Mordecai, who raised her as his own daughter. He hangs around the king's gates to kind of keep contact with her as much as he possibly can. And while he is hanging out in the king's gates, coincidence number one, he overhears of a plot to kill King Xerxes. And so he tells Esther, who goes and tells the king, who has the matter investigated, finds these culprits, has them killed, and it becomes a matter of history. It's recorded in the events of the king. And round about this time, we read of another character in our story. His name is Haman. And the Bible clearly states that he is an Agagite. In other words, you see the connection between 1 Samuel and the book of Esther? He is a descendant of that king who should have been killed. The nation should have been wiped out, but they weren't. And someone remained. Even to this day, his name was Haman. And he is trying to get revenge on the Jews. So he's promoted to this high position, and all of the king's servants are ordered to bow down before him. And of course, Mordecai, who's hanging out with the king's servants because he's in the king's gates, he will not bow down to Haman because a Jew will not bow down to anyone except God. And so this enrages Mordecai, who then sets up a meeting with the king and says, listen, I will pay some of my own money into your treasury if you allow me to kill all of the Jews. To which the king says, hey, this is a good deal. I get rid of some troublemakers, plus I get some money out of the deal. So what do you want to do? So they make plans that on the 13th of the month of Adar, all of the Jews are going to be killed. At this stage, Mordecai hears about this, and he asks Esther to help him. She needs to go and speak to the king. Now, you've got to understand this was not an easy thing to do. Nobody just appeared before the king. If you just appeared unrequested before the king, you could have your head chopped off. And so she says, listen, I'll go and do this, but I need you to pray. Get everyone that you know to pray for me. I'm going to fast and pray for 3 days, and then I will go into the king's presence. And here's where another coincidence comes. The king is feeling good that day. And so as Esther appears, he stretches out his golden scepter and he says, what would you like, my queen? And of course she says, hey, you know what? All I want to do is ask that you would come to dinner with me. And just by the way, invite Haman as well. Haman the Agagite, invite him. News reaches Haman. I've been invited to a banquet with the king and the queen. I'm just such a special person. So he's feeling on top of the world. And while he's going home to go and tell of his good fortune to everyone, he comes across Mordecai. Coincidence again. He comes across Mordecai, who refuses to bow down. Haman is so enraged. He goes and he builds a gallows 23 feet high, and he's going to hang Mordecai from these gallows. He can't wait until the 13th of Adar to kill Mordecai. And another coincidence then takes place. While Haman is building overnight, through the night, building these gallows, the king can't sleep. And so he calls for someone to come and read to him probably the most boring book out, the record of the king's events. I mean, who wouldn't go to sleep having that read out for you? And another coincidence is that the person begins reading and he mentions this plot to kill the king. And the king says, man, I forgot about that. Has the person who told me about this, has he been rewarded? And they said, no, that was Mordecai. Nothing's been done for Mordecai yet. So the next morning, when Haman comes to the king to do his work, you know, nice day at the office, I'm feeling all great. I've got these gallows prepared. I'm going to kill Mordecai. I've been invited to a banquet with the queen. As he walks in, the king says, Haman, what do you think should be done to a man who the king wishes to honor? Haman, he thinks the king is talking about him. I mean, he's so full of pride. So he thinks, I know what, king, I think you should take one of your horses and the person should be paraded on your horse before everyone. Not only that, he should wear one of your gowns, and someone of high importance should lead the horse and needs to cry out, this is what is done to someone who the king wishes to honor. The king says, Haman, I like your plan. I want you to go and do that for, Mordecai the Jew. Hysterical. Mordecai has to go. is paraded in front of everyone by the very man who has erected gallows to hang him. And you can just imagine the scene, Haman saying, this is what is done to someone the king wishes to honor. That night, they go to the banquet, and Esther says to the king, King, the reason I've asked you to come to this banquet is because I'm deeply distressed. Someone has plotted to kill me and my people. And the king says, no ways, who would do this? She says, that man over there, Haman. He has plotted to kill all the Jews, and I am a Jew. My name is actually Hadassah. The king is enraged. He goes off into the garden to try and clear his head. While he goes to the garden, Haman realizes that his time is up. He pleads before Queen Esther for mercy. And here's another coincidence. As he is like pleading before Esther, he literally trips over her. And coincidence, as he is like falling over the queen, Xerxes walks back into the room. And he sees this and he says, and now will you assault my queen as well? Hang this man on the very gallows that he has erected for Mordecai. And that's exactly what happens. The king cannot then at that stage withdraw the edict that he said that all the Jews need to be wiped out. But instead he issues a new edict. And he says now the Jews may defend themselves. And so everything is righted. All the wrongs are corrected. Mordecai is now promoted to prime minister. And phenomenal book, as I said. It's got all these twists and turns and all these so-called coincidences. But actually, they are the fingerprints of God. A load of lessons that we can learn through this book. One of them being that we need to just be ourselves. You know, Mordecai, all these great things happened, but he was just going about doing his daily stuff. Another lesson is that we need to expect God to be acting. Expect God to act on his behalf and for our good. Next, we need to stand firm. I think that's a strong lesson that you and I need to learn for our day-to-day stuff. There are issues of ethics and integrity that we need to stand. Like Mordecai did, he refused to bow down because of his integrity. Another lesson we can learn is that we need to understand that we are actually not that important. You know, when Mordecai wisely asked Esther for help, he said, who knows, but it may be for just such a time as this that God has made you the queen of Persia. But if you don't want to do it, God will raise up someone else. You see, we're not that important. And I think another lesson is that we need to submit everything to God in prayer, as Esther did. But on top of all of this, perhaps more importantly, is that realization that God is in charge of every single aspect of your life and mine. Einstein said this: coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Don't you like that? How many coincidences have you experienced? But perhaps an act of worship is to make sure that God doesn't remain anonymous. Let's give him credit for what he's done. And so may your faith grow to the point where you see God's hand at work all around you.